Think you know everything about Caddyshack? Think again. Behind the iconic Gopher and Bill Murray's legendary improvised monologues lies a cocaine-fueled production nightmare where directors called cut instead of action. Commercial airlines reported fake plane crashes, and one of comedy's biggest stars was nearly replaced by a future boxing legend. From secret restaurant empires to tragic disappearances, these shocking revelations will make you see this golf comedy classic in a completely different light. Fact 1. The original script was Biblesized. When screenwriters Harold Ramos, Brian Doyle Murray, and Douglas Kenney first sat down to write Caddyshack, they had no idea they were about to create what one studio executive would later describe as a screenplay so thick it looked like the Bible. The original draft came in at a staggering 200 pages, which is almost double the length of a typical Hollywood screenplay that usually runs between 90 and 120 pages. To put this in perspective, most comedy scripts aim for about 1 page per minute of screen time, meaning the writers had essentially crafted enough material for a 3.5-hour epic about golf and gophers. Mark Canton, who worked as an executive on the film, remembered being handed this massive document and thinking it resembled a religious text more than a movie script. The sheer weight of the thing was intimidating, and it immediately signaled to everyone involved that this project was going to require some serious editing. The enormous length came from the writer's ambitious vision of creating a sprawling ensemble comedy that would follow multiple storylines throughout the exclusive Bushwood Country Club. They wanted to explore the lives of the caddies, the wealthy club members, the staff, and everyone in between, creating a rich tapestry of characters and situations. The original concept was much more focused on the teenage caddies and their coming-of-age stories, with extensive scenes showing their daily lives, family backgrounds, and personal struggles. However, once filming began in Florida during the fall of 1979, director Harold Ramos quickly realized that the script would need major surgery. The production became so chaotic and improvisational that actors often lost track of which version of the script they were supposed to be following. Pages were constantly being rewritten, scenes were being cut or completely reimagined, and new material was being added on the fly. What started as a biblical-sized screenplay eventually got whittled down through this process of controlled chaos into the 98-minute comedy classic that audiences know and love today. Fact 2. Bill Murray's character wasn't originally scripted. One of the most beloved characters in Caddyshack, the deranged groundskeeper Carl Spackler, was never supposed to exist in the first place. When Harold Ramos, Brian Doyle Murray, and Douglas Kenney wrote their original 200-page screenplay, there was no mention of a mentally unstable golf course maintenance worker who talked to himself about the Dalai Lama and waged war against gophers with plastic explosives. Carl Spackler was born purely out of scheduling convenience and Bill Murray's legendary improvisational skills. Murray had been busy filming the Hunter S. Thompson biopic Where the Buffalo Roam during the summer of 1979 and was committed to returning to Saturday Night Live for the fall season. This left director Ramos with an incredibly narrow window to work with one of his closest collaborators from their Second City comedy days together. When Murray finally became available, Ramos had exactly 6 days to figure out how to use him in the film. Rather than trying to squeeze Murray into one of the existing roles or rewrite major parts of the screenplay, the creative team decided to invent an entirely new character from scratch. They knew that Murray was such a gifted improviser that they didn't even need to write dialogue for him, so they created the role of an assistant groundskeeper and simply turned him loose on the golf course with a few basic story points to hit. The decision proved to be pure genius because it allowed Murray to do what he did best, which was create comedy gold through spontaneous performance. Every single line that Carl Spackler speaks in the movie, from his famous Cinderella story fantasy sequence, while practicing his golf swing to his philosophical musings about caddying for the Dalai Lama, came straight from Murray's imagination in the moment. The writers and director essentially gave him a character framework and then stepped back to let him fill in all the details through pure improvisation. This last-minute addition ended up creating some of the most quotable and memorable moments in the entire film, proving that sometimes the best creative decisions happen when you're forced to think on your feet. Fact 3. Mickey Rourke nearly played Danny Nunan. The role of Danny Nunan, the earnest young caddy at the heart of Caddyshack's story, came down to a final casting battle between two very different actors who would have taken the character in completely opposite directions. According to casting director Wallace Nisita, the decision ultimately boiled down to Michael O'Keefe and Mickey Rourke, with the choice between them representing a fundamental fork in the road for what kind of movie Caddyshack would become. At the time of casting in 1979, Mickey Rourke was 27 years old, and on the verge of his breakthrough years as one of Hollywood's most intense and compelling actors. He had grown up in Miami after being born in Schenectady, New York, and had originally pursued a career as a boxer before two serious concussions forced him to hang up his gloves and pursue acting instead. Rourke had recently been accepted into the prestigious Actors Studio on his very first audition, and he possessed what Michael O'Keefe himself described as the compelling presence of Marlon Brando. Director Harold Ramos found himself genuinely torn between the two actors because each brought something valuable to the table. Rourke was undeniably talented and had a natural, unpolished quality that felt authentic and real. However, Ramos ultimately felt that Rourke's intensity and complexity might overwhelm the light-hearted tone they were trying to achieve. As Ramos later explained, Rourke was great and very natural, but he seemed maybe too real for the movie. In contrast, Michael O'Keefe projected the image of what Ramos called a really good boy, which fit much better with the wholesome, coming-of-age aspects of Danny's character. O'Keefe also had a significant practical advantage in that he was actually a skilled golfer, which would be essential for the many golf scenes throughout the film. Ramos noted that O'Keefe was a scratch golfer, while Mickey Rourke was much more complicated as both an actor and a person. The decision to go with O'Keefe helped maintain Caddyshack's playful, accessible tone rather than turning it into the grittier, more intense character study it might have become with Rourke in the lead role. Fact 4. The gopher used Flipper's sound effects. The mischievous gopher that terrorizes Carl Spackler throughout Caddyshack may look like a furry rodent, but it sounds exactly like one of television's most beloved marine mammals. The iconic chattering and squeaking noises that the gopher makes were actually recycled sound effects from Flipper, the popular 1960s television series about a bottlenose dolphin who helped the Porter family solve mysteries and rescue people in distress around Coral Key Park in Florida. This creative recycling of audio happened during the post-production phase when the filmmakers were working with special effects supervisor John Dykstra, who had previously won an Academy Award for his groundbreaking work on Star Wars. Dykstra's company was responsible for creating all the visual effects in Caddyshack, including the lightning and stormy sky effects, the flying golf balls, and most importantly, bringing the animatronic gopher puppet to life with hydraulic animation that allowed its ears to move and its body to navigate through the elaborate tunnel system built beneath the golf course. When it came time to add vocalizations to the puppet, the sound engineers needed to find audio that would give the gopher personality and make it seem more alive and mischievous. Rather than recording new sounds or hiring voice actors, they decided to dig into the archives of existing television sound effects libraries. The dolphin sounds from Flipper turned out to be perfect for the job because they had the right combination of playfulness and intelligence that the filmmakers wanted the gopher to convey. The choice was both practical and inspired because Flipper's vocalizations were already familiar to television audiences, even if they didn't consciously recognize where they had heard those particular sounds before. The dolphin's clicks, whistles, and chattering had been carefully engineered in the original series to sound friendly and communicative, which translated perfectly to a gopher who was supposed to be clever enough to consistently outwit Bill Murray's increasingly desperate attempts to eliminate him from the golf course. This unexpected connection between a beloved aquatic television star and a troublesome golf course rodent created one of the most memorable and endearing animal characters in comedy film history. Fact 5. A fake plane crash terrorized air traffic. The climactic explosion that ends Caddyshack created such a massive fireball that it accidentally triggered a genuine aviation emergency at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. When Carl Spackler finally detonates his plastic explosives in a last-ditch effort to eliminate the gopher, the resulting blast was so enormous and realistic that a commercial airline pilot flying overhead immediately radioed air traffic control to report what he believed was a plane crash on the ground below. The confusion arose because the filmmakers were shooting at Rolling Hills Country Club, which was located directly in the flight path of planes approaching the busy South Florida airport. During the fall of 1979, when Caddyshack was being filmed, the area around Fort Lauderdale was experiencing heavy air traffic, and pilots were constantly scanning the ground for any signs of trouble or unusual activity that might affect flight safety. The special effects crew had constructed an enormous artificial hill, specifically for this sequence because the real country club owners had made it absolutely clear that they would not allow their actual golf course to be damaged by explosives. The pyrotechnic team built this fake green and hillside from scratch, then loaded it with far more explosives than anyone had anticipated would be necessary to create the desired visual effect for the movie. When the detonation finally happened, the explosion was so much larger and more dramatic than expected that it created a towering column of fire and smoke that was visible for miles around. The blast was powerful enough to completely destroy the artificial hill and send debris flying in all directions, creating exactly the kind of spectacular destruction that would make a pilot think he was witnessing an actual aircraft disaster. Air traffic controllers at Fort Lauderdale immediately began emergency procedures based on the pilot's report, scrambling to locate the supposed crash site and coordinate rescue efforts. It took some time for airport officials to realize that what they were dealing with was not a genuine aviation emergency, but rather an overzealous movie production that had gotten a bit carried away with their explosive finale. The incident became legendary among the cast and crew as an example of just how chaotic and unpredictable the entire Caddyshack production had become. Fact 6. Cocaine was called the film's fuel. The production of Caddyshack became infamous in Hollywood circles for the widespread drug use that occurred throughout the 11-week shoot in Florida during the fall of 1979. Supporting actor Peter Berkrot, who played Angie D'Annunzio in the film, later described the situation with shocking frankness, stating that cocaine was literally the fuel that kept the film running during those chaotic months of filming. The drug problem was so pervasive that it affected nearly every aspect of the production, from the cast's ability to show up on time to their performance levels once they arrived on set. Michael O'Keefe, who played Danny Nunan, later recalled that cocaine was everywhere during the shoot and described his 11 weeks in Florida as a permanent party that never seemed to end. The combination of being far from Hollywood studio oversight, the intense heat and humidity of a Florida autumn, and the party atmosphere created by having so many comedic performers together created the perfect storm for excessive behavior. One of the key figures driving this culture was co-writer and producer Douglas Kenney, who was struggling with severe depression and had developed serious addictions to both alcohol and cocaine. Rather than trying to maintain professional boundaries as a producer should, Kenney actually led much of the cast and crew in their nightly binges, turning what should have been a controlled film production into an extended bacchanal that lasted for nearly 3 months. The situation became so problematic that it began affecting the daily shooting schedule, with cast and crew members frequently arriving late or not showing up at all due to their partying from the night before. The oppressive Florida heat only made matters worse, as people were already exhausted and dehydrated before adding drugs and alcohol to the mix. The production became even more chaotic when a hurricane actually hit the area during filming, flooding the hotel where everyone was staying. and covering the floors with earthworms, which somehow seemed to fit perfectly with the surreal atmosphere that had already taken over the entire project. This environment of controlled chaos and substance abuse became part of the film's legend and may have contributed to the loose, improvisational energy that made Caddyshack so memorable. Fact 7. Harold Ramis filmed the explosion behind owners' backs. The climactic explosion scene in Caddyshack was filmed through an elaborate act of deception that would have made Carl Spackler himself proud. The owners of Rolling Hills Country Club had been very clear from the beginning that they would absolutely not allow any explosives to be detonated anywhere near their pristine golf course, which put director Harold Ramis and producer John Peters in a difficult position since the script called for Carl to blow up part of the 18th green in his final attempt to kill the gopher. The filmmakers had already constructed a fake hillside and artificial green away from the actual course specifically to avoid damaging the club's property, but they knew the owners would still be furious if they discovered that any explosives were being used on the premises. The solution came from producer John Peters, who devised a sneaky plan that involved deliberately getting the country club owners off the property at exactly the right moment. On the day of the explosion shoot, Peters invited the club owners to what he described as a special thank you lunch at an upscale restaurant far away from the golf course. He told them that this was the production company's way of showing appreciation for allowing them to use the beautiful location for their movie, and he made sure to schedule this lunch for exactly the same time that the special effects crew was planning to detonate their pyrotechnics. While the unsuspecting owners were enjoying their fancy meal and discussing how well the filming had been going, Ramos and the special effects team were back at the course, setting up what would turn out to be a much larger explosion than anyone had anticipated. The blast was so powerful that it completely destroyed the artificial hill they had built and created a fireball that was visible for miles around the area. The deception worked perfectly, because by the time the owners returned from their lunch, the explosion had already been filmed and the evidence had been cleaned up. The club owners never found out about the pyrotechnics until years later when the story became part of the film's behind-the-scenes legend, proving that sometimes the most effective way to get permission is to simply not ask for it in the first place. Fact 8. Rodney Dangerfield didn't understand movie directing. Rodney Dangerfield's transition from stand-up comedy stages to movie sets proved more challenging than anyone expected, leading to an awkward standoff during his very first scene that revealed just how unfamiliar he was with basic filmmaking procedures. Caddyshack marked Dangerfield's debut as a major film actor, and while he had appeared on countless television shows like The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, the world of movie production operated by completely different rules that nobody had bothered to explain to him. The problematic scene took place in the pro shop at Bushwood Country Club, where Dangerfield's character Al Chervick was supposed to make his grand entrance and immediately establish himself as the loud, obnoxious outsider who would disrupt the club's stuffy atmosphere. Director Harold Ramis had carefully set up the shot, positioned all the other actors, and made sure the lighting and camera angles were perfect for what should have been a straightforward scene. When everything was ready, Ramis called out, "Action!" in the traditional way that directors signal actors to begin their performance. However, instead of launching into his character, Dangerfield simply stood there without moving or speaking, staring blankly at the crew as if he was waiting for something else to happen. Ramos assumed there might be a technical problem or that Dangerfield hadn't heard him clearly, so he called, "Action!" a second time with the same result. After the third failed attempt, Ramos walked over to Dangerfield to find out what was wrong. The comedian seemed confused and asked if there was a problem, insisting that he was ready to perform. It was then that Ramos realized that Dangerfield was operating according to the rules of stand-up comedy and television variety shows, where hosts or producers would give performers a specific verbal cue that was much more direct and personal than the generic action command used in movies. Once Ramos understood the disconnect, he tried a different approach and said, "Okay, Rodney, now do your bit." Dangerfield immediately sprang into action, and delivered a flawless take that included his famous improvised line about getting a free bowl of soup. From that point forward, Ramos abandoned traditional directing terminology with Dangerfield and simply used the phrase, "Now do your bit," whenever he wanted the comedian to start performing. Fact 9. Ted Knight's final film performance. Caddyshack holds the bittersweet distinction of being Ted Knight's final appearance in a theatrical film, making his portrayal of the pompous and easily flustered Judge Elihu Smales his last major performance on the big screen. Knight, who was born Tadeusz Władysław Konopka to Polish-American parents in Connecticut, had built his career playing self-important characters who were oblivious to their own shortcomings, and Judge Smales represented the perfect culmination of this comedic persona. By the time Caddyshack was released in 1980, Knight was already 56 years old and had achieved his greatest fame playing the vain and incompetent news anchor Ted Baxter on The Mary Tyler Moore Show, a role that earned him 2 Emmy Awards and made him a household name throughout the 1970s. His performance as the uptight country club founder in Caddyshack introduced him to a new generation of fans who appreciated his ability to make stuffy authority figures both ridiculous and somehow sympathetic. What makes Knight's performance in Caddyshack particularly poignant is that it showcased his comedic talents at their peak, with memorable scenes like his confrontations with Rodney Dangerfield's Al Chervik and his infamous meltdown after being hit in a sensitive area by an errant golf ball. Knight brought the same flustered dignity to Judge Smales that had made Ted Baxter so beloved, creating a character who was simultaneously infuriating and endearing. After Caddyshack, Knight continued working primarily in television, starring in his own sitcom Too Close for Comfort, which ran from 1980 to 1986. However, he never appeared in another major motion picture, making Caddyshack his cinematic farewell. In 1985, Knight was diagnosed with colon cancer, and despite treatment, the disease returned and spread to his bladder and gastrointestinal tract. Knight died on August 26, 1986, at the age of 62, just 6 years after Caddyshack's release. His grave marker at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, bears the inscription, "Bye Guy," a reference to his famous Ted Baxter catchphrase, "Hi guys." This final tribute connects his most famous television role with his lasting legacy in American comedy. Fact 10. Sarah Hulkcom vanished from Hollywood forever. Sarah Hulkcom's brief but memorable film career represents one of Hollywood's most mysterious disappearances, as the young actress who played Maggie O'Hooligan in Caddyshack vanished from the entertainment industry after appearing in only a handful of movies, including 2 of the biggest comedy hits of the late 1970s and early 80s. Born on September 11, 1958, in Connecticut, Hulkcom was just 18 years old when she landed her breakthrough role as Clarette DePasto, the 13-year-old daughter of a corrupt mayor in National Lampoon's Animal House in 1978. The success of Animal House, which grossed over $140 million worldwide on a tiny $3 million budget, should have launched Hulkcom into stardom alongside her co-stars like John Belushi and Kevin Bacon. Instead, her follow-up role as Danny Nunan's Irish girlfriend in Caddyshack would mark the effective end of her acting career, making her one of the few performers to appear in 2 massive comedy classics and then completely disappear from public view. According to Chris Miller, one of the co-writers of Animal House, Hulkcom struggled with the fast-paced Hollywood lifestyle that surrounded both productions. Miller later explained that she was young, younger than the rest of us, and found herself caught up with a fast crowd, where drugs were everywhere. He noted that despite her best efforts to avoid trouble, she inevitably ended up in situations she didn't want to be part of and fell into what, for lack of a better term, you would have to call bad company. The pressures of sudden fame, combined with the widespread drug culture of late 1970s Hollywood, proved overwhelming for the young actress. Hulkcom also struggled with undiagnosed mental illness, including schizophrenia. which made it even more difficult for her to navigate the demands of a film career. After Caddyshack was released in 1980, she was briefly cast in Jaws 2 but was released from that project during script revisions. Her story later inspired the character of Dory Lawrence in the 2004 film Stateside, about an actress struggling with schizophrenia. Hulkcom has remained out of the public eye for over 4 decades, reportedly living quietly under an assumed name. Fact 11. Pink Floyd was first choice for theme song. Director Harold Ramos had surprisingly ambitious musical plans for Caddyshack that would have given the golf comedy a drastically different sonic identity, as he originally wanted one of the world's most famous progressive rock bands to create the film's theme song. Ramos first approached Pink Floyd, the legendary British group known for epic concept albums like Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall, to compose and perform the music that would play over the film's opening and closing credits. This choice seems almost surreal when you consider the massive difference between Pink Floyd's complex, atmospheric rock compositions and the lighthearted, accessible comedy that Caddyshack would become. Pink Floyd had just released The Wall in late 1979, a sprawling double album that dealt with themes of isolation, war trauma, and psychological breakdown through elaborate musical arrangements and conceptual storytelling that was about as far from golf course hijinks as you could possibly get. The timing of Ramos's approach was particularly interesting because Pink Floyd was at the peak of their commercial success and artistic ambition, having spent years crafting increasingly sophisticated albums that pushed the boundaries of what rock music could achieve. The Wall had become a massive international hit and would eventually be adapted into a surreal film by director Alan Parker, showing that the band was interested in visual storytelling, but apparently not the kind that involved gophers and country club shenanigans. When Pink Floyd politely declined Ramos's offer, the director had to completely rethink the musical direction for his film. The project eventually landed with Kenny Loggins, a soft rock artist who was building a reputation for creating catchy, upbeat songs for movie soundtracks. Loggins composed and performed "I'm All Right," which became a top 10 hit in the fall of 1980 and perfectly captured the playful, optimistic spirit that Ramos was trying to achieve. Loggins would go on to become something of a soundtrack specialist, later providing memorable theme songs for movies like Footloose and Top Gun with Danger Zone. However, it's fascinating to imagine how different Caddyshack might have felt with Pink Floyd's dark, experimental soundscapes accompanying Carl Spackler's gopher hunting adventures instead of Loggins's cheerful pop-rock anthem. Fact 12. The Gopher was shot after principal photography. One of the most beloved aspects of Caddyshack is the ongoing battle between Bill Murray's Carl Spackler and the mischievous Gopher. But despite appearing to share numerous scenes together, Murray and the famous dancing rodent never actually appeared on screen at the same time during filming. The Gopher that audiences see throughout the movie was completely created and filmed months after the main production had wrapped and all the actors had gone home. The Gopher was originally intended to be a much smaller part of the story, appearing in only one brief scene where Rodney Dangerfield's character would spot it and make a joke about a kangaroo stealing his golf ball. However, during the editing process, director Harold Ramos and the producers realized they needed something to help tie the movie's various disconnected storylines together and make the overall narrative feel more cohesive. The solution came from special effects supervisor John Dykstra, who had previously won an Academy Award for his groundbreaking work on Star Wars. Dykstra suggested expanding the Gopher's role and using the puppet as a way to connect Carl Spackler's subplot with the main action happening around the golf course. Producer John Peters managed to secure additional funding from the studio to hire Dykstra's company to create an elaborate animatronic gopher puppet with hydraulic controls that could move its ears and navigate through an underground tunnel system. All of the gopher scenes were filmed during post-production using carefully constructed sets that matched the lighting and visual style of the original Florida locations. The puppet was operated by skilled technicians who made it dance, pop up from holes, and interact with the golf course environment in ways that would appear seamless when edited together with Murray's performance footage. This clever post-production work required careful planning to make sure the gopher's movements and timing would match up perfectly with Carl's reactions and dialogue. The editors had to study Murray's improvisational performance frame by frame to figure out exactly where the gopher should appear and what it should be doing to create the illusion that the two characters were actually engaged in an ongoing war throughout the movie. The result was so convincing that most audiences never realized they were watching two completely separate performances that had been filmed months apart. Fact 13. Bill Murray stole Lorne Michaels' car for months. Bill Murray's reputation for unpredictable behavior was already well established by the time Caddyshack went into production, but his disappearing act during the summer of 1979 took his legendary status to an entirely new level. Murray had been scheduled to appear in Harold Ramos's golf comedy after finishing his work on the Hunter S. Thompson biographical film Where the Buffalo Roam. But when it came time to show up on the Florida set, Murray was nowhere to be found, and nobody knew where he had gone. The mystery began when Murray somehow gained access to Saturday Night Live creator Lorne Michaels' personal Volkswagen Beetle, a modest little car that would become the vehicle for one of the most audacious joyrides in Hollywood history. Instead of simply borrowing the car for a quick trip around New York City, Murray decided to embark on an epic cross-country adventure that would take him from Los Angeles to Florida to Colorado and various points in between, all while Ramos and the Caddyshack production team frantically tried to figure out when their star might actually show up to work. What made Murray's unauthorized road trip even more outrageous was that he took it upon himself to modify Michael's car during his travels, installing his own custom stereo system without bothering to ask permission from the actual owner. This act of automotive customization showed just how comfortable Murray had become with the borrowed vehicle, treating it as if it were his own personal property rather than his boss's prized possession. The situation put Ramos in an extremely difficult position because he only had Murray committed for 6 days of filming, and every day that passed without knowing Murray's whereabouts meant potentially losing one of those precious shooting days. The production schedule was already tight, and Murray's mysterious absence created additional stress for a first-time director who was trying to manage a chaotic shoot in the sweltering Florida heat. Murray eventually did materialize on the Caddyshack set, presumably after completing his cross-country odyssey in Michael's modified Volkswagen, and he delivered the improvised performance that would make Carl Spackler one of the most memorable characters in comedy film history. However, his extended disappearance became part of the Murray legend and established a pattern of unpredictable behavior that would follow him throughout his career. Fact 14. The Bishop was a silent film legend. The elderly bishop who gets struck by lightning after shouting "Rat farts!" in one of Caddyshack's most memorable scenes was played by Henry Wilcoxon, a distinguished actor whose career stretched all the way back to the golden age of silent films in the 1920s. This casting choice created a fascinating connection between the irreverent golf comedy and the earliest days of Hollywood cinema, as Wilcoxon had been a major leading man during an era when movies had no sound, and actors had to convey everything through facial expressions and physical gestures. Wilcoxon was born in the British West Indies in 1895 and began his acting career on the London stage before making the transition to silent films in the early 1920s. His most significant collaborations came with legendary director Cecil B. DeMille, one of the founding fathers of Hollywood who was famous for creating spectacular biblical epics and historical dramas that featured enormous casts, elaborate sets, and groundbreaking special effects for their time. Working with DeMille during the 1920s and 30s, Wilcoxon appeared in several of the director's most ambitious productions, playing heroic leading men in films that required him to master the art of silent screen acting. This meant he had to communicate complex emotions and story points without the benefit of spoken dialogue, relying instead on carefully choreographed movements, dramatic facial expressions, and precise timing to connect with audiences who were watching these stories unfold in complete silence. By the time Caddyshack was filmed in 1979, Wilcoxon was 84 years old and had witnessed the entire evolution of the film industry from its earliest experimental days through the introduction of sound, color, and all the modern filmmaking techniques that Harold Ramis was using to create his comedy. His presence on the set represented a living link to Hollywood's distant past, bringing decades of professional experience to what would turn out to be a relatively small but unforgettable role. The irony of casting a distinguished veteran of serious dramatic films in a scene where he curses at the weather and gets zapped by lightning was not lost on the filmmakers, who appreciated having such a seasoned professional available to deliver the bishop's outrageous final moments with the kind of theatrical dignity that only someone with Wilcoxon's extensive background could provide. Fact 15. 6 Murray brothers own a Caddyshack restaurant. More than 20 years after Caddyshack became a comedy classic, all 6 Murray brothers decided to turn their family connection to the film into an actual business venture by opening a Caddyshack-themed restaurant that brings the movie's golf course chaos to life in an interactive dining experience. On June 7, 2001, Bill Murray joined his 5 brothers, Ed, Brian, Andy, John, and Joel, to launch this ambitious restaurant project at the World Golf Village in St. Augustine, Florida, creating a permanent tribute to the film that had helped launch Bill's career. The restaurant was specifically designed to look and feel like a country club gone awry, which perfectly captures the spirit of the original Bushwood Country Club where all the movie's mayhem took place. The Murray brothers worked with designers to create an environment that would make diners feel like they had stepped directly into the world of Carl Spackler and Judge Smales, complete with golf course decorations, country club furniture, and subtle references to the film's most memorable scenes scattered throughout the dining areas. The menu itself became a celebration of Caddyshack references, featuring cleverly named dishes that any fan of the movie would immediately recognize and appreciate. Customers can order items like the double bogey cheeseburger, which plays on golf terminology, or the pulled pork sandwich, which combines barbecue with another golf reference. The restaurant also serves something called the Caddyshack, ensuring that even the beverages maintain the golf and movie theme that runs throughout the entire establishment. True to the film's most beloved character, hidden gophers are scattered throughout the restaurant's decor, popping up in unexpected places to surprise diners and create the same kind of mischievous atmosphere that the animatronic gopher brought to the original movie. Wall displays feature photographs and memorable quotes from Caddyshack, allowing customers to relive their favorite moments from the film while enjoying their meals. All 6 Murray brothers remain active partners in the restaurant and occasionally make appearances to meet with customers and share stories about the making of Caddyshack. This family business venture represents a unique example of how a single film performance can evolve into a lasting enterprise that keeps the spirit of a beloved comedy alive for new generations of fans.